Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the strange, twisted story of heroin, a substance that started as a respectable cough syrup in a German laboratory and ended up reshaping the criminal underworld, destroying millions of lives and sparking century-long wars on drugs. You're lying in a Bayer Pharmaceutical lab in 1897, watching a chemist named Felix Hoffmann boil morphine with acetic anhydride. The air smells sharp, chemical, vaguely sweet. He's searching for a safer painkiller, something that won't hook patients the way morphine does. What emerges from his flask is diacetylmorphine, a compound that will soon be marketed under the cheerful trade name heroin, derived from the German heroisch, meaning heroic. Ironic, considering you'd need to be genuinely heroic to survive a full-blown heroin addiction in the early 1900s without medical intervention. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I invite you to leave a comment, sharing where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. It's always warming to know how vast our community of nocturnal historians reaches. Now, you're standing in that laboratory, and Hoffmann has no idea he's just synthesized one of the most consequential molecules in human history. He's actually more excited about the other compound he's perfected this same year, acetylsalicylic acid, which Bayer will sell as aspirin. But heroin? Heroin gets the royal treatment. Bayer's executives are giddy. Early tests on animals and a handful of human volunteers suggest diacetylmorphine suppresses coughs beautifully, relieves pain, even better than morphine, and here's the kicker: produces less nausea and supposedly less risk of addiction. You watch as company doctors scribble glowing reports. One physician declares it a wonder drug for tuberculosis patients who cough themselves bloody through the night. Another notes it helps. Children with whooping cough sleep peacefully. The drug feels clean, modern, scientific. A triumph of industrial chemistry over the messy, unpredictable opium poppy. By 1898, Bayer begins mass-producing heroin in a spanking new factory. You're walking the production line now, past gleaming vats and workers in white coats bottling small brown glass containers. Each label reads heroin in confident serif type, often with a charming illustration of a healthy child or a robust factory worker. The marketing department positions it as a cough suppressant, a respiratory aid, even a treatment for asthma. It's sold over the counter in dozens of countries, no prescription required. You can stroll into a pharmacy in Berlin, Paris, New York, or Buenos Aires and purchase heroin tablets, heroin lozenges, heroin elixirs. Some pharmacists mix it with glycerin and call it heroin glycerite. Others combine it with cocaine for a real pick-me-up cough syrup, because apparently the early 20th century believed more drugs equaled better health. What's remarkable is how respectable it all seems. You're flipping through a 1900 medical journal, and there's an advertisement showing a serene woman in a white gown, smiling as she takes her heroin-laced cough tonic. Doctors genuinely believe they've found a safer alternative to morphine, which by this point has already created thousands of morphine addicts. Civil War veterans, surgical patients, even housewives who are prescribed it for female troubles. Heroin, they reason, won't cause the same dependence because early tests suggest it's metabolized differently. Spoiler alert, it absolutely does cause dependence, often faster and more intensely than morphine, but this won't become obvious for another decade. You're sitting in a physician's office in 1902 now, watching a doctor prescribe heroin to a middle-aged man with chronic bronchitis. The patient returns weekly, then twice weekly, then daily. He insists he needs it for the faux cough, but you notice his hands tremble when the bottle runs low. The doctor, puzzled, increases the dose. This scene is playing out in clinics across Europe and North America. Historians still debate exactly when the medical community realized heroin was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Some point to German case reports as early as 1,899, others to American Medical Association warnings around 1,905. But the consensus is that for a brief, strange window, heroin enjoyed an undeserved reputation as medicine's golden child. Here's a quirky detail. Bayer didn't just sell heroin to sick people. They marketed it to athletes and labourers as a performance enhancer and energy tonic. You're in a Swiss alpine village, watching a mountaineer swig heroin-laced brandy before a climb, convinced it'll sharpen his focus and dull the altitude pain. In New York, dock workers buy heroin lozenges to power through 12-hour shifts. It's everywhere, normalized, even fashionable. And because it's legal, there's no criminal underworld yet, No smugglers, no cartels, no turf wars, just pharmacists, doctors, and patients, all blissfully unaware they're sitting on a time bomb. By 1906, the first cracks appear. A handful of physicians begin publishing cautious notes about heroinism, a dependency syndrome eerily similar to morphine addiction. Patients report they can't stop taking it. Withdrawal symptoms emerge: sweating, vomiting, bone-deep aches, insomnia. You're reading a 1910 medical journal where one doctor describes a patient who, denied heroin, writhed in agony as though possessed. But Bayer's marketing machine is still in full swing, and many doctors dismiss these reports as isolated cases or blame the patient's weak constitutions. The idea that a scientifically designed drug could betray its users so completely feels almost blasphemous in an age that worships industrial progress. You're standing on a bustling street corner in Philadelphia, 1912, watching a woman in a long skirt and feathered hat enter a corner drugstore. She's clutching a handkerchief, dabbing at her nose, playing the part of someone with a lingering winter cough. The pharmacist barely glances up as he slides a small bottle of Bayer heroin tablets across the marble counter. No questions asked, no paperwork filed. She pays with coins, tucks the bottle into her purse, and walks out into the grey afternoon. This transaction, multiplied millions of times across the industrialized world, is how heroin embeds itself into everyday life. By now, it's available in syrups, powders, suppositories, even heroin-laced pastilles that dissolve on the tongue like candy. Medical supply catalogues advertise it alongside bandages and thermometers. It's as mundane as aspirin, which, remember, Bayer also invented and is selling with equal enthusiasm. In Europe, heroin finds its way into sanitariums where tuberculosis patients spend months or years confined to bed rest. You're in a Swiss mountain clinic, watching nurses distribute evening doses. The patients stop coughing, yes, but they also stop complaining, stop fidgeting, stop caring much about anything. Some doctors quietly note this emotional flattening in their charts, but attribute it to the calming effect of finally getting rest. Others are more suspicious. A French physician writes in 1911 that his heroin patients seem unnaturally serene, as though wrapped in wool. He's describing, without quite realizing it, the opiate haze that will define heroin use for the next century. But tuberculosis is still a death sentence for many, so the prevailing attitude is pragmatic. If heroin grants a few months of comfort before the end, who's to object? Meanwhile, in the United States, heroin is riding the wave of patent medicine mania. You're browsing a 1908 Sears Roebuck catalogue, yes, the department store, and there it is, nestled, between liver pills and hair tonic. Bayer heroin tablets, for coughs and colds. Americans are particularly enthusiastic consumers. The country's love affair with self-medication, combined with a booming pharmaceutical industry and minimal regulation, creates a perfect storm. Travelling salesmen hawk heroin elixirs at county fairs. Newspaper advertisements promise it will soothe the nerves and restore vitality. One brand, aimed at mothers, suggests a small dose will calm colicky infants. Historians still shudder at that last one. Here's where things get darker. You're in a tenement apartment in New York's Lower East Side, 1913. A young factory worker has been taking heroin for a persistent cough for 6 months. He's lost weight, his skin has a greyish tint, and his hands shake unless he's had his dose. His wife begs him to stop, but he can't. He's tried, he's gone 2 days without it, and ended up curled on the floor, vomiting, hallucinating spiders. He doesn't understand. What's happening? Neither does his doctor, who keeps prescribing more, assuming the problem is the underlying illness, not the cure. This scene is repeating in working-class neighbourhoods across America and Europe. The word addict exists, but it's mostly associated with opium dens and morphine fiends, not respectable people taking a German pharmaceutical product. Bayer, to its credit or shame depending on your perspective, begins to notice the pattern. Internal memos from 1910 onward show executives growing nervous. Sales are booming, but so are complaints. Some doctors are refusing to stock it. The German government starts asking pointed questions. In 1913, Bayer quietly stops advertising heroin for over-the-counter use, though it continues selling it to hospitals and pharmacies. This half-hearted retreat does almost nothing to slow the drug's spread, because by now, word of mouth has taken over. People know heroin works for pain, for coughs, for for the gnawing anxiety of early, industrial life, and they're not waiting for advertisements to tell them so. You're flipping through medical journals from 1914, and the tone has shifted. Articles with titles like The Heroin Habit and A New Form of Narcotic Dependence are appearing with increasing frequency. One Philadelphia doctor describes treating a patient who injects heroin directly into his veins, a practice borrowed from morphine users, and reports the man experiences an intense, almost instantaneous euphoria, followed by hours of stupor. The doctor is horrified, but also fascinated. He writes that heroin seems to unlock a door in the mind that was never meant to be opened. Poetic, sure, but also an early glimpse of the psychological grip heroin exerts. It doesn't just stop pain, it rewrites the brain's reward system, convincing users that nothing food, sleep, love, survival matters more than the next dose. Here's an odd footnote that rarely makes it into the history books. Heroin briefly becomes popular among opera singers and stage actors. You're backstage at a Vienna opera house in 1912, watching a soprano take a small dose before a performance. She claims it steadies her breathing and calms her nerves without the grogginess of alcohol. Other performers pick up the habit, and for a few years, heroin circulates in theatrical circles as a kind of performance-enhancing drug. Of course, this ends badly. By 1915, several prominent singers have died under mysterious circumstances, officially labelled as heart failure or pneumonia, though insiders whisper about heroin overdoses. The theatre world quietly backs away, but the damage is done. The drug has proven it can seduce not just the sick and desperate, but the talented and ambitious. By 1914, the first legal dominoes are starting to fall. You're in a regulatory hearing in Washington, D.C., listening to a parade of doctors, pharmacists, and public health officials testify about the heroin menace. One physician estimates there are already tens of thousands of dependent users in New York City alone. Another warns that heroin is spreading to undesirable populations, a euphemism for immigrants, the poor, and black communities. This racialized panic will shape drug policy for the next 100 years, but that's a story for a later section. For now, the message is clear. Heroin, the miracle cough cure, has become a public health disaster, and the world is only just beginning to realize it has no idea how to stop it. You're sitting in a cramped physician's office in Boston, 1915, listening to a young man describe his symptoms. He's sweating through his shirt despite the winter cold outside. His pupils are dilated, his nose runs constantly, and he keeps rubbing his arms as though trying to scrape something off his skin. He tells the doctor he's been taking heroin for a year, started with tablets for a cough, graduated to injections because they worked faster. Now he's out of money, out of connections, and his body is staging a full-scale rebellion. The doctor scribbles notes, utterly bewildered. Medical schools haven't taught him how to treat this. There's no protocol, no standard care, no rehabilitation centres. He does what doctors have done for centuries when faced with the unknown. He prescribes a taper, sends the man home with a week's supply of heroin tablets, and hopes for the best. Spoiler, it doesn't work. This same scene is playing out in clinics across the industrialized world. By 1915, the medical community has finally accepted what a few observant physicians suspected years earlier. Heroin is devastatingly addictive, possibly more so than morphine or opium. The dependency develops quickly, sometimes within weeks of regular use. The withdrawal is brutal. Muscle spasms, uncontrollable diarrhea, fever, hallucinations, and a psychological craving so intense it eclipses every other human need. One New York doctor describes a patient who, denied heroin, became convinced insects were burrowing through his veins. Another reports a woman who tried to claw through a hospital window during withdrawal. These aren't isolated cases, they're the new normal. Historians still debate exactly how many people were dependent on heroin by the mid-1910 seconds. Conservative estimates put the number in the tens of thousands in the United States alone, with similar figures in Germany, France, and Britain. More aggressive estimates climb into the hundreds of thousands. Part of the difficulty is that heroin addiction isn't yet a recognized medical diagnosis, so cases get coded as nervous exhaustion, morphinism, or simply chronic illness. But read between the lines of hospital admission records, pharmacy logs, and police reports, and a pattern emerges. A generation of people who thought they were treating a cough are now trapped in a chemical dependency they don't understand and can't escape. Here's where the story takes a legal turn. You're in the U.S. Congress in late 1914, watching lawmakers debate the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act. The bill doesn't outright ban heroin or morphine, but it requires anyone who manufactures, imports, or distributes narcotics to register with the federal government and pay a tax. More importantly, it stipulates that doctors can only prescribe these drugs in the course of professional practice, a vague phrase that will be interpreted increasingly narrowly over the coming years. The Act passes in December 1914 and takes effect in March 1915. On paper, it's a regulatory measure. In practice, it's the first shot in America's century-long war on drugs. You're watching the immediate aftermath now, and it's chaos. Pharmacies that once openly sold heroin suddenly can't or won't, fearing prosecution. Doctors who've been prescribing it to long-term patients panic. Some continue prescribing under the table. Others cut their patients off cold turkey, triggering waves of agonizing withdrawals. A few brave physicians try to establish maintenance clinics, where addicts can receive legal doses to manage their dependency, but federal agents swoop in and shut most of these down within months, arguing they violate the Harrison Act's intent. The message is clear. The government wants heroin users to quit, not to be maintained. The problem is, quitting heroin isn't like quitting coffee. It's a medical crisis that can, in severe cases, kill you. So what do desperate, dependent users do when the legal supply dries? They turn to the black market, which is just beginning to stir. You're in a New York alley in 1916, watching a transaction that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. A man in a threadbare coat hands over a wad of cash to a shadowy figure who passes him a small envelope of white powder. No pharmacist, no doctor, no regulation. The powder might be pure heroin, or it might be cut with flour, quinine, or worse. There's no quality control, no dosage guidance, no recourse if something goes wrong. This is the birth of the illegal heroin trade in America, not because anyone planned it, but because the Harrison Act created a vacuum that criminal opportunists rushed to fill. Here's an odd detail. Some of the first heroin smugglers aren't hardened criminals, they're pharmacists and doctors. You're reading a 1917 court case about a Brooklyn pharmacist who continued filling heroin prescriptions after the Harrison Act, then graduated to selling it without prescriptions, then to buying it from European suppliers and reselling it at a markup. He's eventually arrested, fined, and loses his license, but by then he's made enough money to retire comfortably. Similar stories emerge from other cities. The early heroin trade is amateurish, almost accidental, run by people who stumbled into crime because they saw a demand and a profit margin. But the amateurs won't last long. You're in a smoky backroom in Manhattan's Chinatown, 1918, where a different kind of meeting is taking place. Men with connections to opium dens, gambling parlours, and protection rackets are discussing a new product. Heroin, they realise, has advantages over opium. It's more potent, easier to transport, and commands higher prices. Some of these men have been smuggling opium for years. Pivoting to heroin is a natural evolution. Others are legitimate businessmen who see an opportunity in Prohibition. Within a few years, organised crime will dominate the heroin trade. But right now, in this smoky room, it's still taking shape, a criminal infrastructure being built one handshake at a time. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, European governments are watching the American experiment with concern. Some, like Britain, adopt a more lenient approach, allowing doctors to prescribe heroin to registered addicts under strict supervision. Others, like France, crack down hard, mirroring the U.S. model. Germany, Bayer's home country, is in an awkward position. Heroin is still a source of national pride and export revenue, but the evidence of harm is undeniable. By 1920, Bayer will stop manufacturing heroin for most markets, though it'll continue producing it for medical use in some countries into the 1930 seconds. The genie, as they say, is out of the bottle, and it's not going back in. You're standing on a fog-shrouded dock in Shanghai, 1920, watching wooden crates being unloaded from a cargo steamer. The manifests declare tea, silk, porcelain standard exports. But tucked inside false-bottomed trunks and hollowed-out bolts of fabric are bricks of raw opium and, increasingly, refined heroin. Shanghai has been a narcotics hub since the mid-1800s, when British merchants flooded China with opium and sparked 2 wars. Now, in the chaotic aftermath of World War I, The city has become something darker, a laboratory where criminal syndicates are perfecting the international heroin trade. You're watching triad members negotiate with European middlemen, Russian émigrés who fled the Bolshevik Revolution, and corrupt French colonial officials from Indochina. Everyone speaks different languages, but they all understand the universal grammar of profit. Here's where the underworld truly awakens. The Harrison Act and similar laws in other countries have created a massive arbitrage opportunity. Heroin that cost pennies to produce in a legal pharmaceutical factory now sells for 10 or 20 times that on the street. Morphine base can be smuggled from Turkish or Indian opium fields, refined into heroin in clandestine labs, and shipped to American or European cities where demand is exploding. The barriers to entry are low. All you need is a chemist with basic knowledge, access to acetic anhydride, and a distribution network willing to take risks. Criminal organizations that cut their teeth on bootleg alcohol during Prohibition are diversifying into narcotics. It's capitalism at its most ruthless, entirely unregulated by anything except violence and cunning. You're in New York's Lower East Side now, 1922, walking through streets where heroin has become woven into the social fabric. Not everyone here is an addict, but everyone knows someone who is. A returned soldier who can't shake the morphine habit he developed in a field hospital. A seamstress who started taking heroin for female troubles and now can't stop. A teenage dock worker who tried it at a party and found himself hooked within weeks. The drug doesn't discriminate by class or race yet, though it will soon, as media coverage and policing increasingly focus on immigrant and black communities, but it does tend to cluster in neighbourhoods where poverty, overcrowding, and despair create fertile ground for any escape, chemical or otherwise. Criminal networks are professionalising rapidly. You're sitting in on a meeting of what will later be called the Jewish mob figures, like Arnold Rothstein, who's rumoured to have fixed the 1919 World Series, are now bankrolling heroin smuggling operations. Rothstein doesn't touch the product himself. He's a financier, providing capital to importers and taking a cut of the profits. He's connected to European suppliers, Chinese refiners, and corrupt customs officials at every major port. His operation is sophisticated, coded telegrams, front companies, lawyers who specialise in getting smugglers out on bail. When Rothstein is murdered in 1928, police find ledgers documenting heroin shipments worth millions, a glimpse into an underworld economy that's already rivaling some legitimate industries. Meanwhile, in Marseille, France, another criminal ecosystem is taking root. You're in the old port district, watching North African and Corsican gangs establish heroin laboratories. Marseille has advantages: proximity to Mediterranean shipping routes, a tradition of smuggling dating back centuries, and a corrupt local government willing to look the other way for the right price. Raw opium arrives from Turkey, Lebanon, and Indochina. Chemists, some trained in legitimate pharmaceutical companies, others self-taught, converted into heroin in labs, hidden in warehouses, basements, and rural farmhouses. The product is then smuggled to North America, often via diplomatic pouches or on luxury ocean liners where wealthy passengers unknowingly carry it in their luggage. This network will eventually be known as the French Connection, but in the 1920 seconds, it's still finding its footing. Here's a quirky and disturbing detail. Some of the earliest heroin smugglers are nuns and priests. You're reading a 1923 customs report about a French nun arrested at Ellis Island with 2 kilos of heroin sewn into her habit. She claims she was told the packages contained medicine for the poor. Whether she's lying or genuinely duped is unclear, but customs agents soon discover this isn't an isolated case. Religious figures, travelling on charitable missions, make ideal mules. They're trusted, rarely searched, and often given expedited passage. Criminal organisations exploit this ruthlessly. By the mid-1920 seconds, customs inspectors are under orders to scrutinise clergy as carefully as anyone else, a shift that scandalises the public but proves necessary. Back in the United States, the federal government is struggling to contain the crisis. You're in a 1925 congressional hearing where officials admit they're overwhelmed. The Bureau of Prohibition, established to enforce alcohol bans, is now also tasked with narcotics enforcement, but it's understaffed, underfunded, and riddled with corruption. Agents complain that for every smuggler they arrest, 2 more pop up. Seizures of heroin are increasing £50 here, £100 there, but everyone knows these are drops in the ocean. One frustrated agent testifies that organized crime has more resources, better intelligence, and faster boats than the federal government. It's a humiliating admission, but it's true. The criminal underworld is also innovating in distribution. You're in a Chicago speakeasy, 1926, where heroin is sold alongside bootleg gin. The same networks that move alcohol move narcotics, often literally the same trucks, the same warehouses, the same bribed police officers. This convergence creates a golden age for organized crime. Figures like Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, and Meyer Lansky build empires that span multiple illegal industries. Heroin becomes one more product in a diversified portfolio, insulated from law enforcement by layers of intermediaries and cushioned by vast profits. When Prohibition ends in 1933, some of these organizations will pivot entirely to narcotics, having already built the infrastructure to do so. Historians still debate whether the Harrison Act and similar laws created the heroin crisis or merely responded to it. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Heroin was already addictive and destructive when it was legal. Prohibition didn't make it dangerous so much as make it dangerous and profitable to criminals. But there's no denying that by the mid-1920s, the international heroin trade has become self-sustaining, a shadowy economy employing thousands, generating millions, and feeding a growing population of dependent users who have nowhere to turn for help except the same criminals who sold them the drug in the first place. You're standing in a drafty gymnasium in Washington, D.C., 1914, watching congressmen fidget in folding chairs as a parade of witnesses testifies about the narcotic menace. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act is about to pass, and the rhetoric in the room is electric with moral panic. A police captain from New York describes heroin addicts as fiends who will stop at nothing to feed their habits. A southern doctor warns that the drug is spreading among Negroes in the South, making them forget their place and become violent. An immigration official claims Chinese and Italian immigrants are deliberately poisoning American youth. You're witnessing the birth of racialized drug policy, a framework that will shape enforcement for the next century. The act itself is colorblind on paper, but its application will be anything but. The Harrison Act officially becomes law in December 1914, taking effect in March 1915. Now you're watching federal agents raid a clinic in New York where a progressive doctor has been prescribing maintenance doses of heroin to registered addicts, keeping them functional and preventing withdrawal. The agents handcuff the doctor, confiscate his records, and arrest several patients on the spot. Similar raids happen in Los Angeles, Chicago, Boston. The government's position is hardening. Addiction is not a medical condition to be managed, but a moral failing to be punished. By 1919, the Supreme Court will rule in Webb v. from United States that prescribing narcotics merely to maintain an addict's habit is not legitimate medical practice, a decision that effectively criminalizes maintenance therapy and drives thousands of dependent users into the illegal market. Here's where enforcement becomes nakedly discriminatory. You're reading police reports from 1922 Los Angeles, and a pattern emerges. White users arrested with heroin are often released with warnings or sent to private sanitariums. Black and Mexican users are prosecuted, sentenced to hard labor, and permanently marked as felons. In New York, Irish and Italian immigrants receive harsher treatment than native-born whites. Southern states pass laws mandating sterilization of drug-addicted criminals, a eugenics nightmare disguised as public health policy. Federal agents testify before Congress that heroin is making black men forget their fear of white people, a claim with zero medical basis, but enormous political power in the Jim Crow era. The drug war, from its inception, is a tool of social control as much as public health. You're in a federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas, 1925, watching men serve 5, 10, even 20-year sentences for heroin possession. Many are first-time offenders. Many are withdrawal sick, shaking in their cells, receiving no medical care because guards view their suffering as deserved. Some die, officially of pneumonia or heart failure, but in reality, from untreated withdrawal complications or suicide. The prison system has no idea how to handle narcotics offenders, so it does what it always does. It locks them up and hopes the problem solves itself. It doesn't. Recidivism rates for drug offences are staggering because the underlying addiction is never treated, only punished. Meanwhile, the law creates bizarre contradictions. You're watching a wealthy white woman in Manhattan visit her private physician, who prescribes her heroin under the guise of treating neurasthenia, a catch-all diagnosis for anxiety and depression. She's not arrested because her doctor has plausible deniability and connections. Across town, a working-class Italian immigrant buys heroin from a street dealer to manage the same symptoms and ends up in jail. The Harrison Act, in theory, regulates medical access. In practice, it punishes poverty and marginalized identity. Wealthy addicts get doctors and sanitariums. Poor addicts get prison and criminal records. The Act also spawns a new federal bureaucracy. You're in the offices of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, established in 1930 under Harry Anslinger, a man who will dominate American drug policy for the next 3 decades. Anslinger is a zealot, convinced that narcotics are a moral plague requiring militaristic enforcement. He cultivates relationships with journalists, feeding them lurid stories of heroin-crazed criminals. He lobbies Congress for harsher penalties, more agents, bigger budgets. He's also openly racist, frequently invoking the spectre of black and Mexican dope fiends threatening white America. Under his leadership, the drug war becomes entrenched, bureaucratized, and virtually immune to criticism. Here's an odd historical footnote. The Harrison Act inadvertently fuels medical innovation. You're in a research lab at the University of Pennsylvania, 1,920 seconds, where scientists are searching for non-addictive painkillers. The heroin disaster has made everyone wary of opiates, spurring investment in alternatives. This research will eventually lead to synthetic opioids like methadone, and much later, drugs like oxycodone, which ironically will spark their own addiction crises. But that's decades away. For now, the medical community is chastened, cautious, and deeply complicit in the moral panic surrounding heroin. Physicians who once prescribed it freely now won't touch it, even for terminally ill patients in agony. You're back in Congress, 1924, watching lawmakers pass the Heroin Act, which bans the manufacture, importation, and possession of heroin entirely, even for medical use. The United States becomes one of the first countries to outlaw the drug completely. Advocates argue it's too dangerous to exist in any legal form. Critics warn this will drive even medical users into the black market and enrich criminals. Both are right. The ban is a symbolic victory for the prohibitionists, but it does nothing to reduce demand. If anything, it makes heroin more profitable, more dangerous, and more tightly controlled by organized crime. The law's legacy is a century of underground markets, corrupted law enforcement, and millions of incarcerated non-violent offenders. By the late 1,920 seconds, the architecture of the modern drug war is in place. Federal agents, backed by racist rhetoric and draconian laws, wage a futile campaign against an enemy that adapts faster than they can respond. Prisons overflow with low-level offenders while kingpins operate with near impunity, shielded by layers of lawyers and corruption. And heroin, the cough remedy that started it all, has become the shadow around which an entire legal, criminal, and social system has been built. Remember that gymnasium in 1914? The men in those folding chairs thought they were solving a problem. Instead, they created a template for 100 years of failure. You're crouched in a muddy trench in northern France, 1918, listening to artillery thunder in the distance. A young American soldier sits beside you, his leg wrapped in bloody bandages, waiting for the stretcher bearers. A medic arrives, rifle slung over his shoulder, and produces a small glass syringe filled with morphine. He jabs it into the soldier's thigh without ceremony, no sterilization, no careful dosage calculation, just a desperate attempt to dull agony in a place where screaming men are a dime a dozen. The soldier's face goes slack, his breathing slows, and for a moment he's somewhere else entirely. This scene repeats tens of thousands of times during World War I. Morphine is standard battlefield medicine, handed out like candy to wounded men who might not survive the night anyway. And when the war ends, hundreds of thousands of veterans return home with injuries that throb in the cold, ache in the silence, and whisper for chemical relief. The term soldier's disease already been coined after the American Civil War, when morphine addiction ravaged veterans. But World War I operates on an industrial scale, more wounded, more morphine, more addicts. You're in a veterans hospital in Philadelphia, 1919, watching men who survived Belleau Wood and the Meuse-Argonne now battle an invisible enemy. Some were given morphine for weeks or months during recovery. Others self-medicated with opium or heroin they bought from street dealers near the hospital. The medical staff is sympathetic but helpless. There's no detox protocol, no rehabilitation model, no therapy beyond try to stop, Many veterans do stop through sheer willpower and family support, but thousands don't. And when morphine becomes harder to obtain legally after the Harrison Act, they turn to heroin cheaper, stronger, and readily available from the criminal networks that have blossomed in every major city. Here's where the post-war landscape gets dark. You're walking through the Tenderloin, the district of San Francisco, 1921, where heroin dealers openly work street corners near flop houses packed with unemployed veterans. The war ended, but the economy is in recession. Jobs are scarce, especially for men with shattered nerves and missing limbs. Heroin offers oblivion on the installment plan. A few dollars buys an evening of relief from pain, nightmares, and the grinding reality of a society that cheered them off to war and now crosses the street to avoid them. One San Francisco detective testifies before Congress that half the dope fiends in this city wore the uniform. It's hyperbole, but it reflects a genuine pattern. Veterans are disproportionately represented among heroin users in the 1,920 seconds. The situation is even worse in Europe. You're in a back alley clinic in Berlin, 1923, during the Weimar Republic's hyperinflation crisis. A German veteran with a missing arm waits in line with factory workers and unemployed clerks. They're here to buy heroin, which costs less than bread at this point, because criminal networks are flooding the market with cheap product. Germany, ironically Bayer's homeland, is drowning in the drug it invented. Some historians estimate tens of thousands of Germans are heroin dependent by the mid-1920 seconds, many of them veterans. The Weimar government, overwhelmed by economic collapse and political chaos, can barely address the issue. Clinics are underfunded, police are corrupt, and the black market operates with near impunity. Meanwhile, port cities become heroin epicenters. You're on the New Orleans waterfront, 1924, where longshoremen and sailors move narcotics alongside legal cargo. Heroin arrives from Marseille, Shanghai, and Havana, hidden in shipments of coffee, sugar, and machinery. Dock workers, many of them veterans, are both distributors and consumers. The work is brutal. 12-hour shifts, loading 100-pound sacks and heroin, helps them push through the pain until payday. But payday never quite covers the debt to dealers, so they work more shifts, buy more heroin, and the cycle tightens like a noose. A 1927 police report describes the New Orleans docks as a narcotics bazaar masquerading as honest commerce. You're in a Marseille laboratory now, hidden in a warehouse near the old port. This is where morphine base, smuggled overland from Turkey, gets cooked into heroin. The chemist is a veteran too. French army, gas attacks at Verdun, and he learned his trade in a German pharmaceutical factory before the war. He's thin, coughs constantly, and probably samples his own product. He doesn't see himself as a criminal. He's meeting demand, earning a living in an economy where former soldiers are disposable. The lab produces 5 kilograms a week, which will be divided into thousands of doses, shipped across the Atlantic, and sold in American cities at a 500% markup. Everyone in the chain, smugglers, distributors, street dealers, takes a cut. The profits are staggering, and they're building an infrastructure that will endure for decades. Here's a detail that rarely makes the history books. Jazz clubs become heroin markets. You're in a Harlem speakeasy, 1927, where musicians play until dawn and heroin circulates backstage like sheet music. Many musicians are veterans or grew up around veterans. The drug is normalized in their world. Trumpet players use it to calm their nerves before performances. Pianists take it to numb the pain of playing 6-hour sets. Some become addicted, others use sporadically and walk away. But the association between jazz, heroin, and black communities will be weaponized by law enforcement and media, fueling racist narratives that persist into the 21st century. Federal agents raid clubs, arrest musicians, and feed stories to newspapers about Negro dope fiends corrupting American culture. It's moral panic dressed up as crime fighting. By 1930, the landscape is clear. Heroin has transitioned from a medical mistake to a criminal commodity, from a pharmaceutical product to a tool of economic survival and social control. Veterans, poor immigrants, and marginalized communities bear the brunt both as users and as scapegoats. The black markets spawned by World War I and Prohibition have matured into sophisticated international networks. And the cycle is self-perpetuating. Prohibition creates profit, profit creates violence, violence justifies more prohibition. You're watching the blueprint being drawn for every drug crisis that will follow. You're standing on a rain-slicked dock in Marseille, 1947, watching American military jeeps roll past warehouses that, just a few years ago, stored supplies for the resistance. Now they're storing something else. Morphine base from Turkey, waiting to be refined into heroin. World War II has just ended, and Europe is a shattered continent of displaced persons, black markets, and opportunistic criminals. The French Connection, the most powerful heroin smuggling network in history, is being born in this chaos, and you're watching its midwives, Corsican gangsters, corrupt French officials, and American mafia representatives who've flown in to negotiate supply deals. The Corsicans have a head start. You're in a smoke-filled cafe in the Port District, listening to men with thick accents discuss logistics. During the war, they ran guns for the resistance. Now, they're pivoting to narcotics. They've got everything a smuggling empire needs. Remote labs in the Corsican countryside, chemists, trained in legitimate pharmaceutical work, and crucially protection from the French government. Here's where history gets cynical. The CIA and French intelligence actively shield these gangsters because they're useful anti-communists. Marseille's dock workers are heavily unionized and communist-leaning. The Corsican mob helps break strikes and intimidate leftist organizers. In exchange, authorities look the other way when morphine shipments arrive from Istanbul or Beirut. You're in one of these labs now, hidden in a farmhouse outside Marseille. The process is almost elegant in its simplicity. Morphine base of brown, gummy paste arrives in 10-kilo bricks. The chemist heats it with acetic anhydride in enamel vats, purifies the resulting compound through a series of washes and filtrations, and emerges with white crystalline heroin, typically 80–90% pure. The whole operation takes about 2 days, and can produce enough heroin to supply thousands of addicts for months. The chemist works alone, chain-smoking Gauloises, occasionally glancing out the window for police who will never come. His product will be smuggled to New York in hollowed-out furniture, false-bottomed suitcases, and in one famous case, inside the carcasses of frozen Argentine beef. The American end of the network is run by the mafia, specifically the Luciano family. You're in a New York social club, 1950, where men in tailored suits discuss distribution territories like CEOs dividing market share. Lucky Luciano himself, deported to Italy after the war, coordinates from Naples. His representatives meet Corsican suppliers in Paris, Beirut, and Tangier. The heroin travels by ocean liner, by diplomatic pouch, even by private yacht. Once it reaches New York, it's cut with lactose or quinine, reducing purity to 5 to 10%, and parceled out to street dealers in glassine envelopes, stamped with brand names. Blue Magic, Red Devil, Poison. The markup is obscene. Heroin that cost $5,000 per kilo in. Marseille sells for $200,000 on New York streets. Here's where the French Connection becomes legendary. You're reading FBI files from the 1,950 seconds, and the sophistication is staggering. One shipment arrives hidden in tins of anchovies. Agents open hundreds of tins before finding 30 kilos of heroin vacuum-sealed in plastic. Another comes in a Buick shipped from France. The heroin is moulded into the frame, painted over, and only discovered when a mechanic notices the car weighs 200 pounds more than spec. A third shipment is carried by a French actress who charms her way through customs while her luggage lined with heroin-filled condoms is waved through. For every shipment seized, 10 get through. The French Connection operates for nearly 2 decades, supplying an estimated 80% of American heroin. Meanwhile, heroin use is exploding in American cities. You're in East Harlem, 1955, where entire tenement blocks are ravaged by addiction, families disintegrate, children grow up, watching parents nod off mid-sentence. The drug is everywhere you can score on any corner, any hour. Dealers are young, some barely teenagers, earning more in a week than their fathers make in a month at legitimate jobs. Police conduct sweeps, arrest hundreds, but it makes no difference. The demand is insatiable, the supply infinite, and the French Connection hums along like a well-oiled machine. You're in a congressional hearing, 1958, listening to a federal agent testify about the scope of the problem. He estimates 150,000 heroin addicts in the United States, possibly more. He describes the French Connection's structure. Turkish farmers growing opium poppies, Syrian middlemen smuggling morphine base to Lebanon, French chemists refining it, Corsican smugglers moving it to New York, mafia distributors cutting and selling it. He admits the government has barely made a dent, One senator asks, "Why can't we just stop it at the source?" The agent laughs bitterly. "Senator, you'd have to shut down half of France and Italy, and even then, they'd just move the labs to Spain or Morocco." Historians still debate why the French connection was so successful. Part of it was geopolitical. Cold War priorities meant fighting communism trumped fighting narcotics. Part was corruption, customs officials, police, even judges were on the take. But part was also supply and demand. Post-war America was prosperous but anxious, urbanizing rapidly, and heroin offered an escape from the pressures of modernity. Veterans from World War II and Korea returned with injuries and trauma. Inner-city communities, denied economic opportunity by segregation and redlining, saw the drug trade as one of the few paths to wealth. And the French connection, cold-bloodedly efficient, met that demand with industrial precision. By the early 1960s, the network is so entrenched it seems invincible. You're watching a New York detective bang his head against a wall, literally, after his 10th French. Connection investigation dead ends in a web of shell companies and diplomatic immunity. The criminals are always one step ahead. Better lawyers, faster boats, deeper pockets. The detective knows he's not fighting crime, he's fighting an economic system that's more profitable than most Fortune 500 companies. And he's losing. You're sitting in a humid jungle clearing in the Golden Triangle, 1968, where the borders of Burma, Thailand, and Laos blur into mountains and opium fields. A Hmong farmer tends rows of poppies, their bulbs scored to ooze sticky brown resin that he'll scrape off at dawn. He's been growing opium for generations, its traditional medicine, trade currency, and now, increasingly, a cash crop for foreign buyers. You watch as a CIA officer in civilian clothes arrives by helicopter, shaking hands with a Kuomintang general who controls this territory. They're not here to stop opium production. They're here to encourage it. The general's army fights communists. The CIA needs him on side, and if financing that alliance means ignoring or quietly facilitating the opium trade, so be it. Cold War logic has strange bedfellows, and heroin is about to flood a new market. American soldiers in Vietnam. You're in Saigon now, 1969, where heroin is as easy to find as cigarettes. Street kids sell it, outside barracks. Bar girls offer it alongside beer. The purity is shocking, often 95%, compared to the 5 to 10% cut product on New York streets. And it's cheap, sometimes just a few dollars for a dose that would cost $50 back home. Young soldiers, 18 or 19 years old, terrified and bored in equal measure, start experimenting. Some use it to come down from the adrenaline of combat. Others use it to escape the absurdity of a war nobody can explain. A 1971 study will find that 35% of soldiers in Vietnam have tried heroin, and nearly 20% are physically dependent. It's an epidemic in uniform, and nobody back home knows yet. Here's the ugly part. The South Vietnamese government is complicit. You're watching a general's aide collect envelopes of cash from Chinese syndicates running heroin labs in Saigon's Cholon district. These labs import morphine base from the Golden Triangle, refine it, and sell it to soldiers and addicts with the tacit approval of officials who take a cut. Some American officers know and report it. Their reports vanish into bureaucratic black holes because rocking the boat might upset a fragile alliance. The war effort, everyone agrees, is more important than a few thousand addicted GIs. Except those GIs will come home, and the heroin will come with them in their bloodstreams, their duffel bags, their nightmares. You're back in the United States, 1971, where President Nixon declares drug abuse public enemy number one and coins the phrase war on drugs. It's partly cynical politics, linking heroin to anti-war protesters and black power movements. It's also a genuine crisis. Heroin use has spread beyond inner cities into suburbs and small towns. Overdose deaths are climbing. Emergency rooms are overwhelmed. Nixon announces a two-pronged strategy: treatment for addicts, prosecution for dealers. He funds methadone clinics, rehab centers, and research into addiction. For a brief moment, American drug policy tries. Compassion alongside punishment. But the punitive side quickly dominates. You're watching federal agents, now part of the newly created Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, launch Operation Intercept on the Mexican border, stopping every vehicle for inspection, creating mile-long traffic jams, and seizing token amounts of marijuana while heroin flows through untouched. You're in a federal courtroom where a Vietnam vet caught with a few grams of heroin gets 15 years, while the importer who supplied him sits comfortably in Marseille, untouchable. The drug war, like every war, punishes the foot soldiers and rarely reaches the generals. The French Connection finally cracks in the early 1972, not because of brilliant police work, but because geopolitics shift. You're watching Nixon pressure French President Georges Pompidou to shut down the Marseille labs. Pompidou, facing his own domestic heroin crisis, reluctantly agrees. By 1973, most major labs are raided, chemists are arrested, and the Corsican networks are disrupted. American officials declare victory. Heroin seizures drop, overdose deaths decline slightly, and for a moment it seems like the tide has turned. But you're already watching the Golden Triangle ramp up production. Mexican cartels build new smuggling routes, and Afghan farmers plant poppy fields. The French Connection is dead. The heroin trade is merely evolving. Here's a cultural shift that happens during this era. Heroin becomes intertwined with rock music. You're backstage at a Velvet Underground concert, 1967, where Lou Reed sings Heroin in a deadpan drone that captures the drug's seductive nihilism. You're reading about Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, and Jim Morrison, all dead before 30, all with heroin or opiates involved. The drug acquires a dangerous glamour in counterculture circles, rebellious, tragic, artistic. Musicians who survive Keith Richards, Eric Clapton, will later describe their heroin years as lost decades. But the mythology persists, romanticizing addiction and influencing a generation of young users who think they can flirt with heroin and walk away unscathed. Meanwhile, Black and Latino communities face a different reality. You're in the South Bronx, 1972, where heroin has devastated entire neighborhoods. Buildings are burned out, streets are littered with discarded needles, and young men vanish into the criminal justice system on drug charges. There's no romance here, no rock star myth, just grinding poverty, predatory policing, and a drug that offers brief escape before tightening into a trap. Federal funding for treatment is minimal in these communities. Enforcement is maximal. Historians still debate whether this disparity is neglect or deliberate policy, but the outcome is clear. Heroin becomes another tool of systemic oppression. By the mid-1970s, the landscape has shifted, but the fundamentals remain. Heroin is still destroying lives, still enriching criminals, still eluding every attempt at control. The French Connection is gone, replaced by a hydra of Mexican, Asian, and Middle Eastern suppliers. Vietnam vets are returning home addicted, jobless, and ignored. And the war on drugs, despite Nixon's rhetoric, is already showing signs of becoming the century-long quagmire it will ultimately be. Remember that jungle clearing in the Golden Triangle? The poppies are still growing, the resin is still oozing, and someone, somewhere, is already planning the next shipment. You're standing in a suburban doctor's office in Ohio, 1996, watching a pharmaceutical sales rep in a crisp suit spread glossy brochures across the desk. He's pitching OxyContin, a new time-release oxycodone pill that Purdue Pharma claims is virtually non-addictive because the slow release supposedly prevents the euphoric rush that causes dependency. The doctor, tired and overworked, listens to promises of safe pain relief for his patients with chronic back problems, arthritis, post-surgical pain. He starts prescribing it liberally, 60 pills, 90 pills, refills authorized in advance. You're watching the pharmaceutical industry, with FDA approval and marketing budgets in the hundreds of millions, to recreate the exact mistake Bayer made with heroin a century earlier, selling an addictive opioid as a miracle cure. The parallels are eerie. Just as Bayer flooded pharmacies with heroin tablets in 1900, Purdue floods America with OxyContin in the late 1990s and early 2000s. You're watching sales reps earn bonuses for pushing higher doses. You're reading internal company documents later exposed in lawsuits, where executives discuss ongoing momentum and market penetration, as though pain patients are customers to be captured rather than people to be helped. Doctors receive all expenses paid conferences at luxury resorts where they're trained to prescribe opioids more aggressively. The medical establishment, burned by undertreating pain in the 1980s, swings hard in the opposite direction. Pain becomes the fifth vital sign. Prescriptions explode from 76 million in 1991 to 207 million by 2013. You're in a small-town pharmacy in West Virginia, 2005, watching a pattern emerge. Patients come in monthly for OxyContin refills, but some are coming weekly, then twice weekly. They're running out early, claiming they lost their pills or need higher doses. The pharmacist is suspicious but powerless. The prescriptions are legitimate, written by licensed doctors. What he doesn't see is the doctor's office 40 miles away, where a pill mill physician writes 200 opioid prescriptions a day, no questions asked, cash only. Or the patient, who's already crushing and snorting the pills to bypass the time release, chasing the same euphoric rush that heroin users seek. The infrastructure of a new epidemic is being built, prescription by prescription, in plain sight. Here's where heroin re-enters the story. You're watching a 25-year-old construction worker in Pennsylvania, 2009. He injured his back on the job, got prescribed OxyContin, and now 3 years later he's physically dependent. His prescription runs out. His doctor, facing scrutiny over opioid prescribing, cuts him off. He tries to buy pills on the street, but they're expensive, $30 for a single 80 milligrams pill. Then someone offers him heroin, $10, stronger effect, same high. He hesitates. Heroin is for junkies, not working guys like him, but withdrawal is agony, and desperation erases stigma. He tries it once, then twice. Within 6 months he's injecting daily, and within a year he's dead from an overdose. This story repeats thousands of times across America. The opioid crisis creates a new generation of heroin users who don't fit the old stereotypes. You're in a suburban emergency room, 2012, treating overdose patients who are white, middle class, employ demographics that traditional heroin epidemics rarely touched. Mothers, teachers, veterans, teenagers. They started with legal prescriptions and migrated to heroin when pills became too expensive or unavailable. Law enforcement is baffled, treatment centers are overwhelmed, families are shattered, and the heroin itself has changed. Mexican cartels, seeing opportunity, flood the market with cheap black tar heroin and, increasingly, powder heroin that looks and acts like the pharmaceutical opioids users are accustomed to. Historians still debate how much Purdue Pharma knew about OxyContin's addictive potential. Internal documents suggest executives downplayed risks and incentivized aggressive marketing even after abuse patterns became clear. In 2007, the company pleads guilty to federal charges of misbranding OxyContin as less addictive than it was, paying $600 million in fines, a fraction of the billions in profit. But the damage is done. By 2010, an estimated 2 million Americans are dependent on prescription opioids, and heroin use is climbing sharply as people transition from pills to powder. You're in a congressional hearing, 2016, where parents of overdose victims testify through tears. A mother describes finding her son blue-lipped in his bedroom, a needle still in his arm. A father talks about his daughter, an honor student who got addicted to pain pills after a soccer injury and died from heroin laced with fentanyl, a synthetic opioid we'll discuss shortly. Lawmakers express outrage, promise action, and allocate funding for treatment and enforcement. But the crisis keeps accelerating because the fundamental problem, untreated pain, economic despair, easy access to addictive substances remains unaddressed. Here's a dark irony. The pharmaceutical industry's aggressive marketing of opioids inadvertently revives heroin's fortunes. Mexican cartels, watching American demand soar, expand poppy cultivation in Guerrero and Sinaloa. Production becomes more efficient, purity increases, prices drop. By 2015, heroin is cheaper and more widely available than at any point since the 1,970 seconds. The DEA seizes record quantities ton after ton, but it's meaningless against a market generating billions in profit. You're watching the exact same cycle that played out with the French Connection. Prohibition creates profit. Profit creates supply. Supply meets demand, and the human cost compounds exponentially. The pharmaceutical opioid epidemic also changes public perception. You're reading op-eds and news coverage from the 2010 seconds, and the language is different from previous drug crises. Instead of addicts and junkies, you see patients and victims. Instead of calls for harsher penalties, you see calls for treatment and compassion. This shift reflects, uncomfortably, the demographics of those affected. When heroin ravaged black urban communities in the 1,970 seconds, the response was mass incarceration. When it hits white suburban communities in the 2010 seconds, the response is public health funding. The disparity is stark, shameful, and still unresolved. You're standing in a clandestine laboratory in Wuhan, China, 2015, watching a chemist synthesize fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. The lab looks like any legitimate pharmaceutical facility. Sterile equipment, precise measurements, quality control protocols. But this isn't medicine. It's the next evolution of the heroin trade, and it's about to render everything that came before almost obsolete. The chemist ships his product in unmarked packages labelled research chemicals to addresses in Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Customs agents, overwhelmed and undertrained, wave most packages through. A kilogram of fentanyl, which costs a few $1,000s to produce, can be cut into millions of doses worth tens of millions on the street. Fentanyl's arrival changes the game completely. You're in a Baltimore row house, 2016, watching a street dealer mix heroin with fentanyl powder. He's not a chemist, he's just trying to make his products stronger and cheaper. But fentanyl is so potent that a miscalculation of a few milligrams can mean death. He doesn't care, or doesn't understand, or is just trying to survive in an industry where competition is ruthless. He stamps the mixed powder into glassine bags and sells them by evening. By midnight, 3 of his customers are dead from overdoses. This scenario repeats in Philadelphia, Vancouver, Sydney, Glasgow. Overdose deaths, which had been climbing steadily through the 2000s, suddenly spike vertically. In the United States alone, deaths jump from 33,000 inches, 2015, to over 70,000 by 2019, with synthetic opioids like fentanyl responsible for the majority. Here's the terrifying part. Fentanyl analogues proliferate faster than law enforcement can respond. You're reading DEA reports, listing carfentanil, an elephant tranquilizer, 10,000 times stronger than morphine showing up in street drugs, or sufentanil, or acetylfentanyl, or dozens of other variations synthesized in Chinese and Mexican labs, specifically to evade laws targeting fentanyl itself. Each time authorities ban one compound, chemists tweak the molecular structure and create a legal or legally ambiguous replacement. It's a pharmacological arms race, and the casualties are measured in body bags. Mexican cartels adapt with terrifying efficiency. You're watching the Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation cartels shift from heroin production to fentanyl importation and distribution. Why bother growing poppies, which take months to mature and acres of land, when you can import fentanyl powder from China, press it into counterfeit prescription pills in a warehouse, and generate equivalent profits with a fraction of the risk and overhead? By 2018, heroin seizures at the U.S. Mexico border are declining while fentanyl seizures skyrocket. The cartels haven't abandoned heroin entirely. They're mixing it with fentanyl to stretch supply and increase potency, but the process economic calculus has shifted. Fentanyl is simply better business. You're in a harm reduction center in Philadelphia, 2019, where volunteers distribute naloxone, an opioid overdose, reversal drug, and fentanyl test strips. Users can test their heroin for fentanyl contamination, but many don't bother. Some don't believe the risk, others are so dependent they'll use regardless. You watch a young woman test her heroin, see it's positive for fentanyl, shrug, and inject it anyway. She survives barely because a volunteer administers naloxone within seconds. But volunteers can't be everywhere, and naloxone only works if someone's there to give it. Thousands die alone in bathrooms, cars, and apartments, found hours or days later. Historians looking back will note that the fentanyl crisis represents the ultimate endpoint of heroin's evolution, from natural plant extract to semi-synthetic pharmaceutical to fully synthetic designer drug. Each iteration became more potent, more profitable, and more deadly. You're reading a 2020 CDC report estimating over 90,000 overdose deaths in a single year, more than died in the entire Vietnam War. The report notes that synthetic opioids, primarily fentanyl, account for nearly 2/3 of those deaths. It's a public health catastrophe on a scale that would have been unimaginable even 20 years ago. Yet the response remains fractured and inadequate. You're watching politicians argue over funding for treatment versus enforcement, safe injection sites versus abstinence-only programs, harm reduction versus tough-on-crime rhetoric. Meanwhile, people keep dying. Some states expand access to methadone and buprenorphine medications that manage opioid dependency, while others restrict it. Some cities open supervised consumption sites where users can inject under medical supervision. Others threaten to prosecute anyone involved. The patchwork of policies reflects America's century-long inability to decide whether addiction is a crime, a disease, or a moral failing. Here's a glimmer of something different. You're in Portugal, which decriminalized all drugs in 2001 and shifted resources from punishment to treatment. Overdose deaths have plummeted. HIV infections among drug users have dropped by 95%. Problematic drug use has declined, especially among young people. It's not a perfect model. Portugal is smaller, more homogeneous, with different social structures than the United States, but it suggests alternatives exist. Yet American drug policy, shaped by a century of prohibition, racialized enforcement, and prison industrial complex incentives, resists change with the inertia of an iceberg. You're back in that Chinese lab now, watching the chemist package his latest batch. He doesn't think about the deaths his product will cause. He's just filling orders, making a living in a globalized economy where synthetic opioids are one commodity among thousands. The package will arrive in Tijuana in 3 days, be pressed into pills in 2 weeks, and kill someone in Ohio in a month. The chain is invisible, the profits diffuse, the responsibility impossible to assign. It's heroin's final form, deterritorialized, dematerialized, industrialized death at scale. As of 2025, the crisis shows no signs of abating. New synthetic opioids appear constantly. Overdose deaths fluctuate but remain catastrophically high. Treatment access is improving in some areas, but remains inadequate in most. And heroin itself, the cough remedy that started this whole nightmare in a German lab 128 years ago, has become almost a quaint anachronism, replaced by substances that would have horrified even the most jaded 20th century drug dealer. The underworld that heroin built has evolved beyond it, but the human cost remains unchanged: desperation, addiction, death, and a society that still hasn't learned how to respond with anything but punishment and panic. Now the story draws to a close, and you're lying somewhere comfortable, letting the weight of all this history settle softly around you. A single molecule, synthesized with good intentions in 1897, cascaded through decades and continents, shaping laws, empowering criminals, destroying families, and ultimately forcing humanity to confront uncomfortable truths about pain, pleasure, and the limits of control. Heroin's journey from medicine cabinet to criminal empire reflects broader stories about capitalism, colonialism, war, racism, and the eternal human search for relief from suffering. Perhaps the most unsettling lesson is how little has fundamentally changed. The names and molecules shift morphine to heroin, to OxyContin to fentanyl, but the patterns repeat. Corporate greed, regulatory failure, moral panic, racialized enforcement, and an endless tide of human suffering that no law or war or good intention seems able to stem. If there's wisdom in this history, it's humility. The recognition that simple solutions don't exist for complex problems rooted in neurobiology, economics, and social inequality. The story of heroin isn't over. It's merely paused while we wait to see what comes next. Let those thoughts drift now. Let the details blur and fade like an old photograph. The history is behind you. The night is quiet. And whatever tomorrow brings, tonight you can rest. The criminals and chemists, the addicts and agents, the policymakers and profiteers, they can wait until morning. For now, there's just the soft pull of sleep and the comfort of knowing that understanding the past, even its darkest chapters, is the first step toward imagining a different future. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Let it all go.